In the early 1990s, Lawrence L. Langer conducted over 80 hours of interviews with Boston area Holocaust survivors. These tapes were locked away in a closet for 2 decades until, in 2014, today's guest began crafting a documentary based on the testimonies of these survivors, many of whom have since passed away. After 5 years of hard work, Soul Witness, the Brookline Holocaust Witness Project, will finally premiere this Thursday, February 28th, at a special screening by the Coolidge Corner Theater in Brookline. Today, we have an exclusive interview with the documentary filmmaker and Newton resident Harvey Bravman. Mr. Bravman, it's a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Of course. Tell me a little bit about your work on this documentary.
So in the 1980s in Brookline, Massachusetts, 2 residents, one of Brookline, one was a Holocaust survivor from France, and the other person was a lawyer who, when he was 19 years old and serving for the U.S. military, witnessed the liberation of Dachau. And at that time in the 1980s, people weren't listening to Holocaust survivors. It had been decades, and survivors weren't comfortable telling their stories because people frankly weren't ready to listen to them. And Regina Barshak, who was a survivor, and Leon Satinstein, who was the liberator, came together and formed a committee in Brookline, and with the goal of creating a living memorial to the Holocaust, which would be about Holocaust testimony, or basically listening to survivors.
And what initially drew you to this subject?
Well, the subject drew itself to me, I think. I know the diversity director for the town of Brookline, who's a Newton resident, and he came to me when he began his position, and there was a metal closet in his new office. It was big storage unit, and in it were about 140 3/4-inch U-matic, which were broadcast tapes in those days, tapes, and each tape was part of a interview with a Holocaust survivor.
Right.
And so he contacted me, and I was introduced to that. And I guess my life changed a little bit from that point on.
Why were these testimonies locked away for so long?
Well, the 2 people that found it, so it was a town project, and they were being helped by Yale University, the Fortunoff Video Archives for Holocaust Testimony, and it's hard to explain what happened to them because there's no really good reason.
Right.
But Regina and Leon, who began the project, were getting older, and they were both retired when this was happening. And it was something that was started by a local government entity. So the tapes were placed in a metal closet until they could figure out what to do next with them. They knew most people weren't going to watch a 90-hour movie.
Right.
And there were somewhere between 80 and 90 hours of testimony.
Wow.
So it was kept there until they could figure it out. And then 20 years later, they were still there.
Wow. Was it difficult for you listening to all these stories?
Yeah. Yes, it was. The project was maybe the hardest thing that I've ever done in my life. I have a video production company, but I've never made a feature-length film, certainly not one that's shown in movie theaters. And I had about 7 months because I needed to put my business on hold to do the film. And so I had 7 months not being a Holocaust expert and never making a feature-length film before to take almost 90 hours of footage and condense it into a film that people would understand while watching the most difficult footage I've ever seen. And so it was excruciating.
Yeah.
I would say that I was I had too much perspective at that time from being in their world.
What do you hope people take away from the documentary?
I think it's important to hear from survivors, not just Holocaust survivors, but all survivors. I think that, I hope that what people take away from it is that whatever their views are politically, that's up to each individual, they'll be able to form their views with the knowledge or having been in the shoes of victims of crimes, of refugees, immigrants. These people were all of that. They're survivors of the Holocaust. Then they had to adapt to a new country. And just knowing what that feels like and shaping your views from there, I think it's important.
Why should people come to the screening tomorrow?
Well, there's a couple of reasons. One is that it's a benefit for the Coolidge Corner Theater. So in order to make the film, my wife and I borrowed for what for us was an awful lot of money from our savings. And the only way we could make that take that risk, was that if we had a way of somehow raising money to get it back. And so I went to the Coolidge Corner Theater and I had a great relationship with them. And it's really difficult for a theater to give a screening time to anyone other than the big distributors. They're under a lot of pressure to show films that the distributors want them to show. And so they gave us a screen so that I had an opportunity to sell tickets to the work in progress version of the screening and then get sponsors for that screening. And we didn't know if we'd sell any tickets or if we would get sponsors, but that gave us hope that at least the film would be shown. And that's all we really wanted at that point was for the community to finally hear these voices. These people went through great pain to speak to us and because they thought it was important. And their voices were locked away. Some of them gave their testimony almost 30 years ago in 1990. So I wanted the community to finally hear those voices.
Well, thank you so much for being here today, Mr. Bravman.
Thank you.
Of course. If you're interested in seeing Soul Witness, Coolidge Corner Theater on Harvard Ave in Brookline is hosting a special screening on February 28th at 7 p.m. Newton News will be right back.